and she is a seasoned teacher of the Scripture. So we are really looking forward to this, Laurie. She's a talented, hard-working woman. You saw her resume. She's a doctor. She still treats people, and she had the ability to go back to school last year and get her Master's of Social Justice degree from Phillips Theological Seminary. So an amazing story. Also, a few months ago, she was in Pasadena taking care of her grandson, and the fires broke out, and she had to help the family get out of Pasadena. So she's got some remarkable stories, and we're just so thrilled to have you here, Laurie. So come on up.
Thank you, Keenan. I appreciate that. And I absolutely do not want to disagree with you, but I'm not really a seasoned teacher of Scripture. That would be my husband. So I really appreciate you inviting me to speak. We've enjoyed our time here in this class, and I think it's amazing the diversity of speakers and topics that you have. And I think the fact that you invite so many people and apparently don't even vet them, because I wasn't vetted, and so I assume people could come up here and say whatever they want. So I think the fact that you do that shows a remarkable amount of spiritual and intellectual grace and maturity and openness, and I'm grateful for that. So, but even though I wasn't vetted, I'm very safe. I have no original thoughts, and everything I talk about is from somebody who else is vetted. So this book that I'm talking about is a gentleman who's written several books. He got his MDiv from Fuller, like my husband, so it's all very safe and sound. I did love Phillips. It was kind of an accident how I ended up there. I was researching programs for my daughter. You know how we love our children and have wonderful plans for their life. And I thought that one of my daughters needed to get a master's in social justice. So I researched a bunch of programs, gave her my information, and she said, "Mom, I think you actually need to get this degree." So it is not a Master of Theology, which is more hours. It is definitely not an MDiv, which is twice as many hours. So those are my qualifications, so you can't ask me any theological questions. So one summer, I needed an elective, and there was a class on spiritual traditions that just happened to fit my schedule. So you know how it is in school. Sometimes you just take a class because it's available. And so I took this class by a great professor, Dr. Amy Oden, on spiritual traditions. I wasn't particularly interested in it, but I learned that I needed it, and what I gained from it was, first of all, it was really fun we did a lot of exercises and journaling to see which one we fit into, which of the 6 traditions. And you know, we all love those tests where, you know, are you an otter, or are you a German shepherd, or whatever. And so it was fun to look at the 6 traditions and see which one I was most natural with, or if you will, gifted for, and it ended up not being what I would have thought, so that was kind of interesting. But really, I would say the most important thing that I got out of this class was to recognize that there are a lot of these streams, or some of these streams, that I've always been envious of, that if I was in the presence of someone who had this giftedness, I felt like my faith was anemic, and my experience and expression of the faith was inferior to theirs. And so studying these makes me realize that that's not at all the case. And then the other thing, maybe even more importantly, was I recognized that some of these streams I was very critical of and judgmental of, and felt that my experience was superior to theirs, or my tradition. So it was really interesting to see these things in a different light. So this is based on a book by Richard Foster, and Foster talks about these 6 spiritual streams as being like 6 different tributaries, all flowing into the great river of our communal faith. And what I think that we do, he might have said this in the book, because like I said, I don't have original thoughts, so I probably got this from him, but he makes the point that as clay-footed humans, what we have a tendency to do is think that our stream is the most important one flowing into the river, and the others are minor, or worse yet, they pollute the stream, and if only it was just our stream, then the whole world would join the faith because it would be so unpolluted. So he makes the point that it's very dangerous to look at the other streams, and that's why we need to study them. So, oh, yay, it works. So what are spiritual traditions, and what benefit do we get from studying them? And spiritual traditions are diverse, historic, spiritual paths of Christian faith life. They promote a balanced vision of life and faith. They protect against pride. And they help us consider how Jesus lived in the flesh to help us learn how to live. And we always know that Jesus was the flawless human, which is the things he wasn't. He didn't do bad things. He didn't have bad thoughts. He was flawless. He was perfect. But Foster makes the point that he also was perfect in all that he embodied each of these 6 streams to perfection. And as humans, we probably connect with 1 or 2. We probably live out our lives through 1 or 2. But he was the perfect example of all 6. And in Foster's book, he uses examples of Jesus in each of these streams. And I'm not going to talk about that because they're almost obvious. Each one of these that we discuss, a story will come to your mind of how Jesus embodied these. So the first one, the 6, are the contemplative tradition, a prayer-filled life, the holiness tradition, a virtuous life, the charismatic tradition, a spirit-empowered life, the social justice tradition, a compassionate life, the evangelical tradition, a word-centered life, and the incarnational tradition, a sacramental life. And today we're just going to talk about the first 3, and the next week we'll talk about the other 3. So if you would, think about these things while I'm going through them, because I'm going to ask you these questions at the end, and hopefully end with a lot of extra time, because I'd love to hear your thoughts. So as you think about these traditions, and I know we're just doing 3 today, but do any examples come to your mind of people you've known, church traditions, people that you've read about? Which tradition do you most closely connect with? Which one most closely reflects the tradition you grew up in, if any? Which most closely reflects your current tradition? And is there one you wish you could more deeply experience or exemplify? And is there one that you feel most disconnected from, if any, and why? And I worded that in kind of a nice way. What I really mean is that there one that you're critical and judgmental of. But I know this is a non-critical, non-judgmental group, so I'll just say I have been critical and judgmental of some of them. So the first one is the contemplative tradition, or the prayer-filled life. It refers to the prayer-filled life and is a rich and full practice of the presence of God. According to Teresa of Avila, a 16th century nun and mystic, prayer is an intimate sharing between friends. And Brother Lawrence, a 17th century religious brother, called prayer a wireless and secret conversation between the soul and God, which never ends. So in his book, as I said, he uses 3 examples for each of these. He uses a biblical example, a historical example, and a contemporary example. Contemporary being 19th century forward. So obviously we're just going to skim the surface on these, but I chose one for each of the 3 that we're going to talk about. So I love Julian of Norwich. She was a 14th century mystic. And I'll just go over a couple of her quotes and then go back into her history. I know a lot of you are probably familiar with her. And she has lots and lots and lots and lots of quotes. She wrote for 20 or 30 years. But 3 of hers that I love. God is everything that is good. All life's pleasures and comforts are sacramental. They are God's hands touching us. We are made exactly as God wants us to be. We only need to lift our minds above earth's empty sorrows so that we can rejoice in the divine joy, and all will be well. And one of her most famous sayings is, all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And she actually, God gave that to her as she was speaking to God about evil and hell. And so there's been a lot of controversy that she was a universalist, and she actually had a lot of thoughts that would have been counter to the church of her time. But all of these examples that I'm giving are extreme. So I don't feel anemic next to these people because they're impossibly extreme. But I think make really good illustrations. So Julian of Norwich was an anchoress, which is a term that I just learned recently. And an anchoress in the Middle Ages was, sometimes they were nuns and sometimes they weren't nuns. Like you could be a nun and an anchoress, or you could be nun and not an anchoress. We're not sure whether she was a nun or not. There's some thought that she had been married and had children. But she was an anchoress, and what anchoresses were they were women who at some point made a decision, made a vow to live separate from the world in an enclosed space attached to a church, and with no connection with the outside world, except for some exceptions, which I'll go into. But it was sort of the only way. This is a secular take on her, because I think we all have, even these saintly people, we all have mixed motives. It was the only way for a woman in the Middle Ages to, if you will, have a room of her own. So pretty extreme way to have a room of her own, because she was sealed in and never got to leave, but she really wanted a room of her own. So she got a room of her own. And it also, this was during the Black Death, during the plague, the bubonic plague, which, we can all kind of relate to that. And so she chose in this time to self-isolate and sequester herself. And she lived for 20 or 30 more years. So, wise woman. So when she was about 30, she was very ill and near death. And they brought the priest in to do last rites. I'll go ahead and finish that before I tell you something else. Brought the priest in to do last rites, and she was in this feverish state, and she had 16 visions within 24 hours that she went on to document. And then 24 hours later, she had a 16th. Or she had 15, and then 24 hours later, she had a 16th. The 15 were all seeing Christ's passion in Technicolor and things like being in the bottom of the ocean, and all pointing to God's love. And then the 16th one was very devilish, evil pictures. And so she, for a long time, questioned evil and hell. And anyway, so she had all this when she was very ill, but then she survived. And some people who study her life say she just had a high fever. These were delusions. This was delirium caused by a high fever. Well, who's to say that if we have a fever of 103 and 104, our minds don't germinate spiritual truths and revelations more easily than when we're at our 98.6 and going about our day. So I think it can be both and, not necessarily either or. But she survived, and then she chose to become an anchoress. And part of this process was, after they take their vows, she goes into this room or group of rooms that's attached to a church, and they have a rite where she is dead to the world and lie her out on a pallet, the kind of pallet that they put coffins on, and the priest scatters dirt over her as a symbol of she is dying to the world. And as he leaves, he seals up that door. And she has 3 windows, one looking into the church so she can still partake of Mass and the sacraments. She has a maid or 2, and then there's a window where the maids bring food in, remove trash, that kind of thing. And then another window to the world. And so she spent 20 to 30 years in contemplation and prayer and meditation. And it wasn't just for her own benefit, it was to bless the world. And people would come to her window from all over the world to seek advice. Kind of reminds me of Lucy in the Peanuts, the cartoon. She hung out her shingle, 5 cents. She would get spiritual advice. So she knew what was going on in the world. She wasn't a hermit. And all her training and meditation and speaking with God, she used to bless the world. So she documented these 16 visions and then spent the rest of her life in prayer and contemplation expounding on them. So in her texts, she has a short text, which is just the visions, and then a long, long text, which I can't get through. I tried to read some of it before this. Let me just say, I am not of the contemplative tradition. I make lists. I can't sit and pray. So she A lot of her visions seem to contradict and criticize the clergy of the Middle Ages, and here she was attached to the church. But the kind of cool thing about anchoresses versus nuns is they weren't actually under the authority of the church. They had to prove that they had the means of sustenance, so they're probably from a middle or upper class family. But a lot of her visions were counter to what the church was teaching at the time. And she was very critical of the clergy in her writings. My guess is she didn't share any of this with the clergy because this was also the time of people being burned at the stake for being a heretic, and it didn't take much to be a heretic. And even though I can't wrap my mind around all of her readings, she has a devotional that I have really enjoyed called All Will Be Well, or something like that, All Will Be Well, 30 Days with Julian of Norwich. And you read some of these things and think she probably would have been burned at the stake if she had said these things, because she saw Jesus in a very different way that Jesus was portrayed in the clergy at that time. And God was presented in that time as a wrathful God, and the clergy were teaching that the Black Death and the plague was because of the wrath of God, and anything that questioned the power of the authority of the church was considered heretical. She also had a vision. You guys probably should have vetted me. She really saw God as equally mother and father. And I was reading her devotional this morning. I took a screenshot of it just in case we have time at the end. But and that wouldn't have been popular at that time because God was presented as a very angry, wrathful person. So again, this is probably the one that I have been most envious of in my life. And when I'm in the presence of someone or reading of someone who has this gift or this stream, I feel anemic and inadequate. And how can I call myself a Christ follower when I can't even sit for 5 minutes without making my to-do list? But I have friends that are contemplatives, and I have a good friend from our years in California, Janet, who's the poster woman for contemplation. And she can sit in her one spot in her living room for hours and hours and hours and read and study by her fire and come up with, I think, revelations of divine love, just like Julian of Norwich. But this is a very contemporary woman. She's got a husband, she's got a family, she's out in the world, she does things. And again, just like Julian of Norwich, her messages from God are not wasted. They're not just for her. She shares with others. And she was a really powerful Bible teacher at our church. So if I ever need prayer for anything, I just text Janet. I don't even bother trying. So Janet talks to God and I talk to Janet. So that works out. But Janet will light a candle in her window, and we have, our younger daughter was recently diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and it was very painful for me as a mother to know how her life was going to change. And I didn't know how to pray for her. I just sent her books, here's how to be a diabetic and be happy about it. And no, not really, I wasn't that bad. I did get her a t-shirt that I haven't given her yet. I'm waiting, but it says, "Nah, signed my pancreas." So it's too early. I'm not giving it to her yet. So the strengths, and just one other thing about being, and I have contemplative friends here too, one that I think probably a lot of us know, so I won't use her name because I didn't get her permission, although she wouldn't have cared because she's just off in Jesus' world all the time somewhere. But when I spend time with my friends who are deeply contemplative, I always get a headache. So Janet and I often had lunch and coffee together. Literally, I always had a headache because I was trying to understand what she was talking about, trying to get on her level. And I didn't know if her level was way up here above me or way down here deeper than me, but it was somewhere where I don't exist. But from studying these, I recognize I don't have to have all these gifts. I don't have to be a contemplative, but I do have to just appreciate their gifts. So, the contemplative tradition's strengths, they force us beyond merely cerebral religion. There is a stress upon silence and a call to unceasing prayer, and it emphasizes the solitariness of our life with God. And both of my friends, and certainly Julia of Norwich, spend lots and lots of time in solitude, but then they take what they gain from that and bless their world. Contemplative tradition, potential perils, a tendency to separate from ordinary life, a tendency to devalue intellectual efforts to articulate our faith, and the tendency to neglect the importance of the community of faith. So that's the contemplative stream. The next one, the second one, is the holiness tradition, or a virtuous life. So this one is harder. As I was reading about these and learning about them, this one was a harder one for me to grasp because I can't think of specific individuals, or I know there's a holiness church, but it kind of fits in, I think, a little bit with charismatic. But this was a harder one for me to wrap my head around. And the examples he uses in the book, I thought those people fit even more strongly in some other traditions. But holiness means the ability to do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. It means being responsible or able to respond appropriately to the demands of life. The word virtue simply means to function well. Virtue is good habits that we can rely on to make our life work. And the goal of the Christian life is not simply to get us into heaven, but to get heaven into us. So I was teaching this at a different church last year, and my husband wasn't there. This is the first time my husband's been in the audience when I was teaching. So I asked Debbie to pray for me and thank you, because you clearly are, because I'm fine. What holiness doesn't mean, so I was teaching this at a different church, and I was confessing that I can't really think of good examples of this. And one of the women in the class said it reminded her of first responders. And I thought, how perfect is that? Think about firemen, and they train and train and train and train, even though they don't use their training every day. Suddenly, they're needed and they're able to respond. So she's making the point, or the Foster is making the point, in the holiness tradition, if we train and train and train and train in spiritual practices, then when something happens that we are called upon, it happens automatically. So holiness is not rules and regulations. It's not works righteousness. It's not perfection. It's attention to purifying the source out of which all action flows. What is inside the person will come out. Do y'all know the example of the person walking down the street with the coffee cup? So somebody's walking down the street and you've got your coffee cup, and you can't have a lid because that ruins the metaphor. So you've got your coffee cup, no lid. And you're walking along and the coffee's staying in your cup just fine, no issues, till someone bumps into you. And then the coffee spills. And it's all over them, it's all over me, it's all over everyone around us. And obviously it's a very smart group. I don't have to explain the metaphor, but the coffee cup is our inner life, and the coffee is what we put into it. It's our beliefs, our attitudes. It's our training. It's what we are daily training ourselves to be. And when I know for sure that I'm lacking in the holiness issue is whenever I'm on the phone with a service representative from AT&T. And my friends and some of my family members think I'm a nice person, and my coworkers, I have a reputation. Debbie's my former college roommate. We both had reputations as nice people, but I can be on the phone. In fact, sometimes my daughter would hear me, and she would say, "Mom, if you have to make a phone call like that, I need to be sitting with you and hold you accountable." And so as many times as I've thought about this, my entitled, irritated self comes out. And then I know what's in that coffee cup. Not that I necessarily do anything about it, but it's good to be self-aware. So the tradition, the example that I am using for this is out of the Bible. We used a historical example. Now we're going to use a Bible example. And it's James. And again, I'm not a Bible scholar in any way, but I've always liked the book of James. So if I knew a sermon was going to be on James or Sunday school lesson, I thought, okay, I can get this because James is short and practical, and I can do short and practical. And plus our newest grandbaby is named James, which I love. And So James gives much attention to purifying the source out of which all action flows. So he gets a bad rap for being about works righteousness. And apparently, and this isn't something I knew, I've just been reading about it this week, there was some conflict, supposedly, that Paul thought James was too much into works righteousness and it needed to be faith alone. And James, I really didn't know this, but he was a leader. He was the head of the Church of Jerusalem after Jesus' death and was very well respected and was even in some meetings with Paul where they would discuss theological issues, and Paul deferred to James. So James is really a bigger deal than I ever realized. One of the things I love about James, he is the biological brother of Jesus, or half-brother, if you will. They had different dads, right? And Jesus had several younger brothers who are all named in the Bible. He had some sisters, but they didn't have names. But we know he had brothers and sisters, and apparently none of them believed that Jesus was the Messiah. And this is so easy to understand. We had 4 kids, and our oldest, we called him the king of the sibling subset. He was dominant. They all adored him. But if he had ever said he was the Messiah, which he probably thinks he is, none of them would believe it. It's understandable. But after Jesus died and was resurrected, everyone that he made himself visible to was a believer, except James. And he made himself visible to his brother James, who was not a believer, which I think is so gracious and so courteous and so beautiful. And James was convicted, became a Christ follower, and became a leader of the church. So he talks about works righteousness, and no, he doesn't. Oh, sorry. No, it's not works righteousness. That's the bad thing that you say about him. But he talks about if you have faith, it will result in good works. So I think he's such a good example of holiness. It's the training, the faith leads to good works. It's not the good works that save you. And basically the Epistle of James is a commentary on the Sermon on the Mount, which we just went through at this church last fall. So he sums up pure and undefiled religion in a simple twofold action: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. So you can see why I like him. It's simple. It's all you have to do. But I was kind of hung up on keeping yourself unstained by the world. And I think I've always tended to see that as living a pure life. No smoking, no drinking, no cussing. And I could, with integrity, wear the t-shirt that says, I love Jesus, but I cuss a little. So... only in private and only when it's completely justified on the Broken Arrow Expressway. So I was hung up on that word unstained, and I looked at the Greek, which I don't look at Greek. I've never taken Greek. I'm not a Greek scholar. It's my husband's area. But that didn't help. And then I looked up a definition in Webster's dictionary. That didn't help. So sometimes I think synonyms help me as much as definitions. So I looked up synonyms for unstained, and 2 stood out to me that I really liked. They were unmarred and unmutilated. So James is saying, keep yourself unmarred and unmutilated by the things of the world. And how I read that was, it's so easy for us to go into despair and depression and bitterness and tribalism and paralysis that we can't act. And so he's saying, to me, if I read that backwards, keep yourself unmarred and unmutilated by the things of the world, and then you will, through right action, care for the orphans and the widows and the oppressed and those treated with injustice. And it kind of made me think, circling back, because these all tie together. Julian of Norwich was living in the era, in a horrible, horrible era. Not only was there the Black Death, and there was the Peasant Revolt, there was the 100-Year War, people were being burned at the stake, and her little room was on a was on a major thoroughfare, so she would have known what was going on in the world. And also, people were being burned at the stake in an area where she would have smelled the smoke and smelled the burning flesh. So she knew what was happening, and she chose not to be marred or mutilated in her soul and destroyed to where she couldn't commune with God to bless the world. So I don't think that's theologically sound to take synonyms and then turn them into what I want them to be, but we probably all do that. So that's the holiness tradition. The strengths are an ever deeper formation of the inner personality to reflect the goodness of God. This work is solitary and interior. It's tough-minded, down-to-earth, practical understanding of how we grow in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ. And one other thing about that is, one other comment that he made, is by undertaking the disciplines of the spiritual life that we can do, we receive from God the ability to do things that under our own steam we simply cannot do. And we'll see this in the charismatic stream too. That's a primary understanding of the next stream. So, holiness, tradition, potential perils, legalism, works righteousness, and perfectionism. So the next stream is the charismatic tradition. The focus is on the empowering charisma, or gifts of the Spirit. And the sign of the presence of the charismata is that the effects of one's actions greatly exceeds the input of the human being. And have you ever had times in your life where things turned out better than they should have based on your input? I feel that way about all 4 of our children. They didn't turn out all that great, but a whole lot better than what our input was. Have you all heard the metaphor of the little boy at the concert hall that he's playing chopsticks? I just hate to use these same cheesy examples if everybody's heard them 100 times. We've all grown up in the same town listening to similar sermons. But so a mother took her little boy to a great concert hall to hear a great pianist. And the little boy, there's a huge, gorgeous Steinway on the stage, and the pianist hasn't come out yet. And the little boy runs up on stage and starts playing chopsticks. And everybody's yelling, "Get him down, get him down." And then the great pianist comes in and says to the boy, "Don't stop, keep playing." And he stands behind him and he creates a beautiful piece, with around the chopsticks. And that's always stayed with me as a visual of how if we just don't stop and just keep playing, that God will come around us and make something beautiful out of it. So I think we tend to have a picture of this as extraordinary external manifestations of the Holy Spirit, such as speaking in tongues and dramatic healings. This is another one that I've always been borderline envious of, borderline, I'll use the word, judgmental of, because I don't understand it, because I've never spoken in tongues and haven't had the experience of dramatic healings, at least the ones that are presented scripturally. But something that was really reassuring to me was that some charisms, clearly expressed by Jesus, was the charism of wisdom and that of discernment. So this charismatic stream isn't always dramatic external expressions. It can be wisdom. If you develop wisdom and discernment in a situation that there's no reason why you should have had that, then that's part of the charismatic stream as well. So I actually can think of so many examples of this. Obviously in our town, Oral Roberts, Catherine Kuhlman, and several people that are in our current world. But the one I chose to highlight is a contemporary example, again, 19th century forward. The leader of the Azusa Street Revival in Los Angeles from 1906 to 1915, William J. Seymour is known as the father or one of the fathers of the Pentecostal movement. His story is amazing, and I don't have time to go into it, but he was living, in the early 1900s, and slavery was no longer supposedly with us, but it was a horrible time racially with Jim Crow laws and lynchings and, terrible discrimination. There's nothing new under the sun. And but he was an extremely gracious, humble, loving person with warm regard to everyone. And his dream was to have a integrated church where everyone, of all socioeconomic levels, all genders, all races come together where they had glossolalia in common. So from 1906 to 1909, this church, which was in an old warehouse that he rented, they had 3 formal services a day, but they had hundreds of people in the church and surrounding the church 24 hours, 7 days a week for 3 years. So it was a huge explosion of charismatic revival, which has gone on to where there are, however many billion Pentecostals in the world, I don't know. And he would go to these services and he would put a wooden box over his head and spend hours and hours and hours talking to God. And then when he would take the box off, then the service would start. And they had these crazy miraculous healings, which, there were journalists and a lot of these things were documented. He's just kind of a fascinating person, son of freed slaves. But his bottom line was that it was all about love, and love, of course, incorporates a lot of things, but it incorporates right action, as spoken of in the holiness tradition. And one of his quotes is, "The Pentecostal power, when you sum it all up, is just more of God's love. If it does not bring more love, it is simply a counterfeit." And one of the people in my life that exemplifies this was, I had a cousin, Jean, who passed away last year, and she was the poster person for charismatic life, and one of the most loving people I've ever known. But when I would spend time with her, I would feel so completely inadequate and anemic, and I just let her talk, because what did I have to contribute? And she had a prayer closet that she would spend hours in, reading, studying, dancing with Jesus, playing her tambourine. And her son at her service was eulogizing her, and he said he would have friends over spending the night, and 3 o'clock in the morning they hear these crazy sounds, what's going on? It's just Mama, she's in her prayer closet. So, and you hear these stories, these charismatic stories about getting exactly the money that you need at a certain time, and Seymour has this beautiful story, I won't go into it, but beautiful story about how he got the money to rent this building for the first time. And that's a kind of thing that I tend to be suspicious of, because I'm just left-brained. I have a very poorly developed right brain. And so I think, somehow that's not a miracle. But this kind of thing where you get a testimony to talk about in church. Here's my testimony. So one time, my husband was running for the state legislature, so he had taken a leave of absence from his church, which had been paying him. So leave of absence, no paying. And I had a good job as a physical therapist, gave that all up, went back to osteopathic medical school. And we had bought a house, not realizing that we were both going to choose to be unemployed for an extended period of time. And our parents would have helped us, but we weren't going to ask our parents, because they probably thought we were moronic to give up our good jobs to chase these dreams, which we're glad we did. But so one time we'd been at a meeting, we came home, my cousin Gina is sitting in the driveway. I don't know that she even knew about what was going on in our lives. Certainly no way she would know how much our mortgage payment was. And she was sitting in our driveway just waiting for us to come home, and she handed me an envelope, and yes, it was exactly our mortgage. So that kind of thing needed to happen to me to say, okay, I got it. Maybe those miraculous healings did happen on Azusa Street. So just one thing, I want to wrap up my part, and then I want to hear from you all. But one commonality that I see between these 3 streams is, first of all 3 of these people were people of intense prayer. Obviously, Julian of Norwich spent decades in prayer. And what else was she going to do? She's locked in this room. So she didn't have to cook or change diapers or anything. So she prayed constantly. James, the brother of Jesus, was known for having camel knees, because he spent so many hours in prayer that his knees were calloused. And then William J. Seymour spent 5 to 7 hours daily in prayer in a group of people with the box over his head. So all these people had in common was prayer and love being a warm regard for all persons, and actions that came out of that love. So the commonality I see between these three streams is prayer leads to love, leads to right action, which leads to more prayer, to more love, and more right action. So that's the first three streams. Oh, let me go on. I'm sorry. The charismatic strengths, ongoing correction to our impulse to domesticate God, offers a constant rebuke to our anemic practice, and offers a continuing challenge towards spiritual growth and development. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. In the charismatic tradition, potential perils are a danger of trivialization, danger of rejecting the rational and the intellectual, and the danger of divorcing the gifts of the Spirit. We need both emotion and reason. They're not opposites that we have to choose between. They are both and rather than either or. So back to the questions. Do any examples come to your mind of any of these traditions? Is there one that you most closely connect with, even if it's not necessarily the tradition or stream that you think is part of your community? I could make a judgment and say what I thought was the most common stream of this church, which I won't, but I assume that there are people from all 6 of these streams in this church, even though there is maybe one that the church collective exemplifies. Which one most closely reflects a tradition you grew up in, if any? Which most closely reflects your current tradition? Is there one you wish you could more deeply experience or exemplify? And which do you feel the most disconnected from, if any, and why? So, and I gave you the questions at the beginning, so you were forewarned.
I need a review before the test.
Sorry, it's a lot. And we'll certainly talk about it next week, too, after we've gone through all 6 of them, because these answers to these might, for you all, be in the next 3, which is the social tradition, the social justice tradition, the evangelical, and the incarnational.
We have one back here, but is there anybody
Laurie, we did vet you. Just for the record, we did vet you before we asked you to speak today.
Well, did you just ask my husband? He goes, yeah,
No,
she's
and
good.
you have excellent reviews.
Thank you.
My question, or my answer is the one I'm most disconnected from is the charismatic. You know, my best friend in high school went there and actually spoke in tongues, she thought, and I just didn't get it. I mean, it was really, and when you say judgmental, I tried not to be judgmental because I was really glad she was in a church somewhere, but that is a very, and by the way, I was raised in Church of God, so, and you know, for a while, so it's a very similar, but I didn't get any of that. I just still am in awe that there is that level of, I don't know, spirituality. You know, your words are better than mine, but it's the one I'm not comfortable with, I guess I say. And I do love the lessons. I love your storytelling. You're really wonderful.
Thank you, thank you. And the charismatic was the hardest one for me too, and I think the fact that that church exploded and has stayed exploded speaks to how important it is. And my love and experience with my cousin too makes me appreciate the validity of it. Thank you. Yeah.
I dipped my toes in the charismatic experience for a while I was pastoring at Forest Park. And I have shared this before. I was getting the fake nails for a while, and one of my church members recommended. Anyway, the lady I went to was going to a charismatic church at the time, and she's the one that I've said, in terms of my ministry, that she pretty much said, all you need to do is walk in the fruits of the Spirit, you know, and you'll be covered. But they had Friday night services, and I attended for a while just to experience it. And one time they asked me to preach, and I was like, okay, which I did. But afterwards they'd have a prayer time, and you could go up and somebody pray for you. And yes, there'd be people that would, you know, fall in the Spirit and walk around. Anyway, it was just a wonderful experience to experience that. And I remember being envious of just this power that they absorbed from the Spirit and then gave out. And the whole talking in tongues and all of this, that's fine. But anyway, when I told the elders about, attending these Friday night, they just were not real happy about it. But, and eventually I stopped. But anyway, I'm grateful for that time to be around people that just were so, filled with the Spirit. And it was, the shocking thing was after I preached, then they do the prayer time. And then they said, Kim, why don't you be one of those people that, lay hands on people and whatever. And I was like, oh, good Lord, I don't, but I did it anyway. And that was, anyway, it's, yes. I would not say I'm at the charismatic bin, but I am grateful for that period in my life and to experience, which I think if all of us can experience other ways of like all these traditions you're going to be sharing with us. So anyway, that's just what I wanted to say.
Well, thank you for sharing that, and I think that the test of all these things is, does it result in the fruits of the Spirit? And with us being in Tulsa and connected with Oral Roberts and Oral Roberts University, our experience has been some of the most Spirit-filled, loving, effective, holy people we've ever known are from Oral Roberts University. And it's easy to be dismissive of something that the culture is dismissive of. And one of the other things that I noticed in these readings, like all of these examples, especially someone like William Seymour, who most of the people at his church were the very downtrodden. Even though it was integrated, it was mostly black people, and they were washwomen and janitors and porters and people that were in the depths of Jim Crow. And even Seymour, he went to Houston for a while and wanted to take theological classes. And of course it was for whites only, but the professor there said, you can listen in, I'll keep the door open and you can sit outside and listen. So he was in that milieu or whatever with no bitterness, no anger, and still love. But I think the point I was trying to make is there's something about suffering and being in that very lowest point where you can have some of those experiences. And I think that's part of my issue, why I have trouble with the charismatic stream and contemplative is I'm not suffering. I'm good. So, yeah.
Dr. Clark, I have a...
Laurie, please.
Right.
I'm sorry they put that up there.
Sorry, I was an EMT. It's always Doc.
Thank you. Thank you.
I was overwhelmed when I took a screenshot and then copied these down. I was a little overwhelmed, and I thought, wait a minute. We each have some of these attributes. And it's like Maslow's hierarchy, the self-actualized. We're going to be jack of all trade, hopefully master of some. So I'm taking notes because that's what ADD people do, take notes and then review them. But I'm excited because, all we can do is strive. We will never achieve perfection, but I started to get overwhelmed and think, okay, I can walk out and go talk to somebody in the foyer, but after I saw your breakdown, so great job, and I can't wait for next week.
Thank you so much, and I love ADD people. One of my favorite kids has ADD, and three of our kids, we say, have file cabinets in their brain, and Charles has fireworks, and so I love the way an ADD mind, and thank you so much for bringing that up. There's so much in this book that, of course, I couldn't go over, but that's one of his points, is we all have the ability to tap into any of these, and we also have the ability to strengthen our muscles in some of these. So, yeah, great point. Thank you. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
I think your comments about the traditions are great. I have a pretty loud voice. What I wanted to say is, and I think I'm most comfortable with the contemplative tradition. However, I think that you talked about how we're marred by the world and mutilated. You even use that word. That's pretty intense. However, I think that time management, the speed of our world has really thrown us off of these kinds of self-improvement, should I say, or contemplative practices. And there are a few things that I use to help me because I get distracted. I probably have ADD as well. And some of these things are like Lectio. I've done some practices over the internet. And I believe sometimes the church stresses too much us to a call to action. Get out there and preach the gospel and tell people about Jesus and your experiences with Jesus. Yes, I think that's important, but I think these things also help to prepare us to do that. So any comments you could make? And I also wanted to bring up that women at that point in time, the Julian of Norwich, they couldn't read or write. And she must have written and read and been quite an intelligent woman. So yay for that.
Her writings, her texts, the short text and the long text, was apparently the first published work of a woman in England. And it's thought that she either had training before she became an anchoress or afterwards, because there was an Augustinian seminary there, and they think that she was trained. But that's such a great point, and it's why it makes it even more impressive. And I think you're so right. I think we are uniquely in a time that it's hard to be contemplative. And someone who spoke here last fall, and forgive me if it's someone in this room I don't remember, it was a gentleman, and he asked us what was the one day in the 21st century that had the biggest impact on our culture. Do you all remember who that was? And we all had, great answers, but the answer he was looking for was, I don't remember the exact date, but something like July 29th. Oh, he said, do you know what happened on July 29th, 2007 that impacted our world? And it was when the first iPhone came out. And so clearly that has affected our distraction. And how many of you, I won't say that I do this, but how many of you, get cozy on the couch and you've got your book or your Kindle and you're like, we're just going to check Instagram for just a second, and an hour later your book is still sitting there, or your devotional, or your intent to be contemplative and prayerful, and your iPhone is there. So, but it's here to stay. I don't know what the answer is, but I think you're so right. And that's great that you feel that that's your calling, and it's, yeah.
Psalm 1 is a good psalm, prayer. Psalm prayer, about the trees being nourished by the water. Spirit. My car tag says changing water, or living, because I'm thinking living waters, or that's Native American, which is the waters of Jesus, springing up in us. So, Psalm 1, I love Psalm 1.
Oh, that's good. Thank you. Okay. Thank you all so much. And then at the end of next time, you'll have to all say what you are, because we'll have gone through some.
Thank you.
I'm just kidding. We won't do that. But thank you so much.